Yes.
Hello. I'm here to talk to you about the subject of non-fiction, which is a subject I'll be doing with you in this semester. And I'm just going to lay down a little bit of introduction about this subject. The first question that comes is what is non-fiction? Of course, non-fiction, in a very simple way, is something which is not coming out of from our imagination, but it is coming from reality. So, fiction is something which comes from our imagination, and non-fiction is something which comes from the real world that we live in. So, how does non-fiction start? Right from the birth of cinema, which was, of course, the capacity of a camera to record a world, a moving world, a world in movement, a world in three dimension, and of course, projected on a screen. That was cinema. So, as cinema developed in terms of a language, in terms of its form, in terms of how and what it was planning to do, two things emerged. In a sense, cinema took two directions. One was a direction towards storytelling, which of course is centuries old and hundreds of years old. Man's desire to tell stories, man's desire to listen to stories, and stories which happen in a world of imagination. So cinema started telling stories. It tried to create a world which came from a fictional platform. It was a fictional world. And in this world, man started placing his stories and started telling them through films. So that is, of course, what we see as mainstream cinema, what we see as fictional cinema, what we see to entertain ourselves, what we see as our favorite pastime today, to watch films, to watch these wonderful characters, to watch these wonderful stories. So that is, of course, the one direction that cinema took. The other direction that cinema took was towards the real world, to show us the real world, to show us what happens in this real world, to raise issues about this real world. So, in a sense, these two directions was towards fiction and towards reality, non-fiction. So, of course, if you look at the beginning of cinema, cinema begins with non-fiction. The first films that you all know in terms of history were these Lumiere shot actualities, the first films, which is, of course, the camera recording reality. So that is how cinema began. So non-fiction was, in a sense, the true sense of how cinema began. And then, of course, the language of editing was developed, and of course, this whole idea of connecting space and time happened, and that is why it became possible for cinema to tell stories. But at the same time, this whole world of non-fiction, the whole world of the camera recording reality and bringing us closer to the reality, that was the world of non-fiction. Later on, a term developed called documentaries. This whole non-fiction was given a name, a title. It was called documentary films. So we have documentary films and we have fictional films. So these are the two forms that cinema takes: the narrative form, which is storytelling, and the non-narrative form, which is documentaries. So in a sense, non-fiction is about documentary films. And of course, within this broader form of documentary films, smaller forms developed. We can see advertising films. It's a kind of form which came out of non-fiction. We have many promotional films. So these documentaries also had these subgenres: sports films, travelogues, corporate films. So all these subgenres of documentaries developed right from the beginning. But like I said, in a very, very broad sense, in one single umbrella, it's called the documentary films. So that is going to be the subject of your non-fiction that we are going to be covering. And of course, documentary also has its own history. Documentary also has its own development, how it developed. And of course, documentary also is a very important part of cinema. I know we are all attracted towards fictional films. We are all attracted towards the stars. We are all attracted towards these wonderful worlds that we are encountering when we're watching films. But at the same time, it is very necessary for us to look at the real world and to be able to use camera to express this real world. So one of the first definitions of documentary films, of course, documentary film is reality, but the first definition is a creative treatment of that reality. We are not just showing reality. We are encountering reality as a documentary filmmaker and then, of course, imparting our own subjective vision on that reality and then showing it to audiences. So ultimately, the whole world of documentary films comes through the eyes of the documentary filmmaker. So that is going to be the beginning of our journey. That is going to how we're going to move to see documentary in its different forms, in its different genres, and to see how the camera's capacity to encounter and to present reality